Blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel without you even realizing it. You weren't speeding, you didn't run a light. You're literally pulling into your own driveway, and yet the patrol car rolls up behind you like you just fled a crime scene. The engine is still running when the officer steps out, already watching your every move like he expects something to go wrong. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever been questioned or detained by police when you genuinely believed you did nothing wrong? And how did you handle it? Drop your answer in the comments, because what you say might reveal something important about how people react in these moments. And later on, I'm going to break down a mistake that most drivers don't even realize they're making until it's too late. Let's talk about a situation that sounds almost unreal until you understand how these encounters actually unfold. A man is on his own property, not on the street, not in a public park, not outside a bar at midnight, his own property. His neighbor hears what she thinks are gunshots. She calls the police. Within minutes, officers arrive, adrenaline already elevated before they even step out of the vehicle. This is where people misunderstand how fast things escalate. From the officer's perspective, this isn't a casual complaint. This is potentially an active shooter situation. Even if it turns out to be nothing, they don't approach it like, maybe it's fireworks. They approach it like, someone could be injured right now. So when officers pull up, they're already in a heightened mental state. And that matters more than people realize. Now picture the man. He's on his property. Maybe he's in his yard, maybe in his garage, maybe just stepped outside after hearing sirens. He's confused, maybe even annoyed. Because from his perspective, he hasn't done anything wrong. And here's where the disconnect begins. The officer sees uncertainty, possible danger, incomplete information. The homeowner sees intrusion, accusation, and overreach. That gap right there? That's where most arrests are born, not necessarily from criminal intent, but from misunderstanding, tone, timing, and reactions. You might think, well, if I'm on my own property, they can't do anything. That's one of the biggest myths out there. Being on your property does not make you immune from police interaction. It changes certain legal thresholds, yes, but it doesn't create a shield where officers just walk away if someone calls in a potentially dangerous situation. Now let's slow the moment down, because this is where things get real. The officer approaches. "Sir, we got a report of gunshots. What's going on?" That question sounds simple, but it's not just a question. It's a probe. It's an evaluation. It's the officer trying to quickly assess whether this is a harmless misunderstanding or something that requires immediate control. And this is where people make mistake number one. They answer emotionally instead of strategically. Imagine the homeowner responding like this. "I'm on my own property. I don't have to tell you anything." Legally, that might be closer to the truth than people think, but tactically, that response raises suspicion instantly. Because from the officer's perspective, silence combined with defensiveness doesn't read as law-abiding citizen asserting rights. It reads as unknown risk refusing to cooperate. And now the tone shifts. "Sir, I need you to step over here." Notice the word need. That's not a suggestion anymore. That's the officer starting to take control of the scene. Now here's where things get even more complicated. People often believe that if they just stand their ground, the officer will eventually back off. But in reality, officers are trained to escalate control when they feel uncertainty. They don't retreat from it. So if the homeowner hesitates, questions authority, or starts arguing, the officer interprets that as resistance. Not necessarily criminal resistance, but behavioral resistance. And that can be enough to justify detaining someone temporarily. And yes, even on their own property. Let me paint a more detailed picture of how this plays out. The officer asks again, slightly firmer now. "Have you been firing a weapon tonight?" The homeowner pauses. Maybe he's thinking about his rights. Maybe he's irritated. Maybe he just doesn't like being questioned. That pause, just a few seconds, feels much longer to the officer. Because silence in these moments isn't neutral. It's information. The officer starts watching everything. Hands, shoulders, breathing, eye movement, even how the person shifts their weight. These aren't random observations. Officers are trained to read behavior under stress. Now imagine the homeowner crosses his arms or puts his hands in his pockets. To him, it's comfortable, natural. To the officer, it's a red flag. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Now tension increases, and this is where a small decision can change everything. If the homeowner complies calmly, the situation might stabilize. If he responds with, "Why? I didn't do anything," the officer hears defiance layered on top of uncertainty. And that's when things can spiral. Because now the officer isn't just investigating a report, he's managing a person who isn't aligning with his expectations of cooperation. And here's something most people don't realize. Officers don't need absolute proof of a crime to detain someone temporarily. They need reasonable suspicion. And a 911 call about gunshots, combined with behavior that feels evasive or resistant, can be enough to cross that threshold. So now the officer says, "Turn around for me." This is the moment people remember. The moment things go from questioning to physical control. The homeowner might think, "This is illegal, I'm not doing that." And that decision right there is often what leads to arrest. Not necessarily the original complaint, not the alleged gunshots, but the refusal to comply with what the officer believes is a lawful command in that moment. Now let's talk about the neighbor for a second. People love to throw around the term Karen, and sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't. But here's the reality. Anyone can call the police if they believe something dangerous is happening. The law doesn't require them to be right. It requires them to act in good faith. So if a neighbor hears loud pops and believes they're gunshots, calling 911 isn't automatically malicious. It becomes a problem only if it's knowingly false or intended to harass. But once that call is made, the system is in motion, and it doesn't slow down just because the situation turns out to be harmless. Now here's where things get even more layered. Let's say the man was actually doing something legal. Maybe he was using a tool that made loud noises. Maybe it was fireworks. Maybe it was something else entirely lawful. That doesn't immediately end the situation, because officers still need to verify, and verification takes time. And during that time, your behavior matters more than your innocence. That's a hard truth for people to accept. You can be completely within your rights and still escalate a situation to the point where you get arrested, not because you committed the original suspected act, but because of how you handled the interaction. Now let's bring this back to traffic stop dynamics, because the psychology is almost identical. You're pulled over. You didn't do anything wrong, or at least you think you didn't. The officer approaches, starts asking questions that feel unnecessary. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is there anything illegal in the vehicle? These questions aren't always about getting direct answers. They're about observing how you respond. Tone, hesitation, consistency. And here's something people rarely think about. Officers often already know more than they're telling you. In the case of the homeowner, they might already be scanning the area, looking for shell casings, listening for echoes, watching for other witnesses. So when they ask a question, they're not always starting from zero. They're filling in gaps. And if your answers don't align with what they're observing, that creates friction. Now imagine this scenario stretching out longer. The officer holds the homeowner's ID longer than expected, keeps asking variations of the same question. Are you sure you didn't discharge a firearm? Anyone else here with you? Mind if we take a look around? That repetition isn't accidental, it's pressure. It's a way to see if your story changes under stress. And people do change their stories, often unintentionally. Not because they're lying, but because stress affects memory, wording, and confidence. And when your answers shift even slightly, the officer notices. Now let's talk about stepping out. If the officer asks, or orders, the homeowner to step away from a certain area, people often resist because they feel it's an overreach. But from the officer's perspective, controlling space is about safety. Distance reduces risk. And when someone refuses to create that distance, It signals unpredictability. Now we get to the moment where everything clicks into place. The officer decides to detain the man. Handcuffs come out, and suddenly, the homeowner who thought he was protected by being on his own property is being placed under arrest. Not necessarily for firing a weapon, but possibly for obstruction, resisting, or failure to comply, depending on how the interaction unfolded. And this is where people say, "That's not fair," and they're not entirely wrong. But fairness isn't what dictates roadside or on-scene decisions. Immediate control and perceived safety do. The courtroom is where fairness gets argued. The roadside is where control gets established. If you remember nothing else from this, remember that distinction. Now, here's the part I told you earlier I'd come back to, the mistake almost everyone makes. People think asserting their rights means resisting in real time. It doesn't. Asserting your rights effectively often means staying calm, limiting what you say, complying with lawful commands, and addressing any violations later through legal channels. Because once you escalate physically or verbally, you shift the entire interaction. You go from someone being evaluated to someone being controlled. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to reverse. So what should someone do in that exact scenario? Keep your hands visible. Answer basic safety-related questions without volunteering unnecessary information. Avoid sudden movements or gestures that could be misinterpreted. If you don't want to answer further questions, say it calmly and clearly without attitude. "I'd prefer not to answer any more questions." That sounds very different from, "I don't have to tell you anything." Same meaning, completely different impact. And impact is everything in these moments. Because officers are human, they react to tone, behavior, and perceived threat just like anyone else, except they have authority layered on top of that perception. Now think back to the beginning. Blue lights behind you, or officers stepping onto your property. You don't control why they're there. You don't control what they've been told. You don't even control their initial assumptions. But you do control how you respond. And that response can either narrow the situation or widen it into something you never expected. So the next time you hear someone say, "Just stand your ground," ask yourself, do they understand what that actually looks like when adrenaline is high, voices are raised, and decisions are being made in seconds? Because in real life, it's not about winning the argument in the moment. It's about getting through the moment without turning a situation into something permanent. And once you've seen how quickly something like this can unfold, from a neighbor's call to handcuffs on your own property, you start to realize that the smallest decisions, the ones that feel insignificant at the time, are often the ones that matter the most.